He could sit alongside marshals. Generals listened when he spoke. His signature unlocked access to the Soviet Union's darkest secrets. But it wasn't an American super agent or a Hollywood hero who saved the world from nuclear catastrophe. It was a Soviet colonel. Oleg Penkovsky, a high-ranking GRU officer, military analyst, and decorated war hero, seemed to have a perfect career: elite education, top-level connections, and the full trust of the system. He had access to the most classified information, from nuclear strategies to the launch protocols of intercontinental missiles. In the USSR, doors opened for him without question. But in the West, he became the spy who changed the course of history. He had everything the Soviet system could offer its loyal sons: a war veteran, a GRU colonel, a recipient of state honors, a refined man with top-tier military training. His career was nearly flawless, working in military headquarters, joining international delegations, and handling ultra-classified documents, including data on Soviet missile capabilities, nuclear strategies, and strike plans. And yet, he betrayed his country. Not for money, not because he was blackmailed, not out of revenge. Oleg Penkovsky betrayed the USSR because he believed it was the only way to save the world. His personal transformation began in the final years of Stalin's rule. After the war, he watched as frontline heroes disappeared into prisons or simply vanished. He saw how the system punished not guilt, but independent thought. How fear became the common language of command. Penkovsky was no fool. He was sharp-minded and understood the bigger picture. When he began working more closely on nuclear issues, everything changed. He realized the USSR was bluffing. Khrushchev played the bad cop on the international stage, threatening to send rockets to the US. But in truth, the Soviet arsenal was incomplete, unreliable, and the command structure was dangerously weak. It wasn't a shield. It was a distorted mirror designed to project the illusion of a superpower. And this bluff, paired with aggressive politics, could have easily triggered nuclear war. Penkovsky watched as the West panicked, believing in a fabricated Soviet advantage. And he understood, if nothing changed, the US would eventually launch a preemptive strike. Or worse, Khrushchev might decide to go all in. Either way, the world would burn. He couldn't allow that to happen. He wasn't siding with Kennedy. He didn't become Khrushchev's enemy. He chose humanity. This decision didn't come overnight. He observed, he analyzed, he spoke with colleagues, and saw firsthand how common sense had no place in the system. His perspective finally crystallized when he realized even those making the decisions were trapped in fear and delusion. None of them had a clear idea of what the next escalation could bring. Penkovsky couldn't simply resign. He knew that either he acted or he became a silent accomplice. Early 1960s. The Soviet Union was celebrating its triumphs. Gagarin in space, Khrushchev banging his shoe at the UN, newspapers screaming about technological superiority over the West. Everything looked powerful on the surface. But Penkovsky saw something else. He saw the lie. He knew the truth. The missile program was crude. The command structure, chaotic. Communication between branches, catastrophic. In the event of war, the system would collapse under pressure. And the most terrifying part? No one in the Politburo knew this, or wanted to know. That's when the disillusionment set in. Penkovsky wasn't an idealist or a poet. He was an officer, a strategist, a military rationalist. He had served in the GRU for years, seen post-war Europe, and earned the respect of top brass for his sharp military mind. But he was also inconvenient, independent, analytical, capable of thinking one step ahead. And in a system that didn't tolerate independent minds, that made him dangerous. During his foreign trips to the United Kingdom, France, Turkey, he saw a different world. Not a better one, necessarily, but a different one. A world where people lived with less fear, where opinions weren't punished. And from that, a plan began to form. Not to defect, not to ask for asylum, but to do something no Soviet colonel had ever done before, to become a source of truth. and deliver it where it might actually make a difference. April 1961. Hotel Metropole. Dusk settles over the city, but inside the hotel, everything is glowing with warmth and elegance. A string quartet plays in the lobby. Waiters move like clockwork. The air is thick with champagne, imported cigarette smoke, and the gentle murmur of English conversation. It's a diplomatic reception, hosted by the Soviet government for foreign guests, mostly students, cultural figures, and trade delegates. Among the crowd is a young man in a tweed jacket, a Leica camera hanging around his neck. His name is Frederick Pryor, a graduate student in economics visiting Moscow to study the Soviet system. He's just snapped a few photos of the grand room and now stands near the refreshments table, sipping mineral water. He's a guest, nothing more. Not an agent, not military, just a tourist. Then a man approaches him. Well-dressed, not very tall, fit, with the posture of a soldier. In his hands, what looks like a tourist gift set, a few postcards of the Kremlin, the old Arbat, Lenin's mausoleum. He smiles, politely, not too warmly, and says in slightly accented English, "Excuse me, may I offer you something to remember Moscow by?" Pryor, a bit puzzled, accepts the souvenir. Things like this were often handed out at Soviet receptions. But just then, the man briefly places a hand on Pryor's shoulder, like a signal light flickering, and says in a calm, low voice, just loud enough for Pryor to hear, "Please, take this to the British or American embassy. It's important." His voice is steady, cold, determined. He doesn't beg. He doesn't repeat himself. He speaks like a man who knows there will be no second chance. Then he turns and walks away, calmly, no rush. He disappears into the crowd, as if he was never there. Pryor stands there, holding the souvenir. His fingers feel something rigid inside the folded paper. He steps aside, opens the booklet. Inside is a small, precisely folded sheet of paper. He unfolds it. In clear handwriting, in English, it reads, "I am Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, GRU. I wish to cooperate. I can help you understand Soviet military capabilities. Please trust this message. My intentions are sincere. Time is limited." Pryor doesn't know what to do. He's not 007, he's an academic. But his gut tells him, this is something serious. He hides the note, quietly takes it from the reception, and by the next day, it reaches the hands of the people it was meant for. This is how one of the greatest intelligence stories of the 20th century begins. A few days after the diplomatic reception in Moscow, a small package arrives through the diplomatic mail at the British embassy. It's carefully wrapped. Inside is a plain envelope with no official markings. Within it, a thin sheet of paper, no watermarks, written in neat, precise English handwriting. An intelligence officer at the embassy reads it and freezes. Below that, a date, a signature, a title. Colonel, GRU Moscow. This doesn't look like a cheap setup, and it doesn't sound like a desperate defector begging for asylum. It reads like a military confession, a warning, a strategic offer. MI6 receives copies, and tension fills the air. Several key figures at the MI6 headquarters on Broadway Street, London, read the message. Analysts, field officers, Eastern Bloc specialists, and their first thought is, this can't be real. A GRU colonel with full access to the nuclear program reaches out on his own. No recruitment, no blackmail, no compromise. Almost impossible, unless it's a trap. What if the KGB is trying to plant a fake source to discredit Western intelligence from the inside? Everything depends on the next move. The decision, proceed. But carefully, no missteps, no obvious moves. MI6 leadership agrees. He must be verified, but without exposing official agents. So they start searching for a clean contact. Someone with no ties to British intelligence, no military background, no connection to spy networks. But someone with access to the Eastern Bloc. They need the perfect mule. London, fall 1961. Street, James's District. Greville Wynne receives an invitation to lunch at a private gentleman's club. Nothing unusual. He's a businessman with clients in Bulgaria, Hungary, even the USSR. Meetings like this are part of his routine, but when he enters a private room at the club, he realizes this isn't business as usual. At the table sit two well-dressed men, polite but oddly restrained. They don't introduce themselves. They don't offer to shake hands. They get straight to the point. We have a contact in the Soviet Union. A person at a very high level. A military officer. He wants to pass on information. His life is already at risk. But we can't move officially. We need a bridge. And we've chosen you. Wynn takes a sip of whiskey, puts down his napkin, looks at them closely. I'm an agent? Number. And we don't want you to be. You're a businessman, a courier, a shell. Someone no one notices. You simply receive and deliver. No names, no theories, no explanations. And if I say no, then nothing happens, we finish lunch, shake hands, and part ways. But the world becomes just a little more dangerous. Pause. Wynn doesn't respond right away. He looks out the window. Rain, a London bus rolls by, everyday life, calm. But something is shifting inside him. He wasn't looking for adventure, but something in the phrase "lives could be saved" catches hold of him. Why me? He finally asks. Because you're invisible, and that is your superpower. And then, without drama, without ceremony, Wynn says, "All right, I'm in." 1961. The Soviet capital lives in its usual rhythm of paranoia. Foreigners are watched. Hotels are bugged. The streets are filled with people who never meet your gaze, but see everything. The air is thick with fog, smoke, frost, and fear. After Penkovsky's secret outreach to the West, through a brief note handed to a random American student, London begins to act. Carefully. Incredibly carefully. Because if it's a trap, it's perfect. But if it's real, they may be facing the most valuable source any analyst could dream of. But there's no way to speak directly with Penkovsky. Phones are tapped. Streets are unsafe. Any meeting would raise suspicion. So a meeting must be arranged that looks like pure coincidence, while also serving as a precise signal. Enter Greville Wynn, a businessman who's already traveled to Moscow, someone whose face is familiar to the Soviet system, someone with no KGB file, someone who looks boring. His cover, participation in an industrial trade exhibition. He's genuinely representing a British company that sells pump equipment. His presence in Moscow is official, explainable, routine. But a few days before his flight from London, a message is quietly passed, through intermediaries. One of them, a Bulgarian engineer who once worked with Penkovsky in an international delegation. The message is simple, neutral. A representative from London, interested in cooperation, will be in Moscow on December 12th. He'll be staying at Hotel Ukraina. His technical solutions may be of interest to you. Penkovsky reads the message during an official meeting. He doesn't blink, doesn't flinch, says nothing. But he understands everything. December 12th, Moscow. Hotel Ukraina. In the lobby, a familiar flow of foreigners, Soviet officials, translators, and plainclothes officers. The hotel restaurant is one of the few places where foreigners are allowed to dine with Soviet representatives. Greville Wynn arrives at 6:30 p.m., dressed as always, a simple suit, neatly combed hair, a diplomatic bag over his shoulder. He requests a table by the window, orders a coffee, and opens a technical brochure, Industrial Valve Solutions 1958. 7 minutes later, Penkovsky enters the room, wearing a dark suit and a steel gray tie. He doesn't look directly at Wynn, chooses a different table. But when the waiter approaches, Penkovsky gestures toward Wynn's table. "You seem to be from Britain?" "Yes, we work on hydraulic systems. Interested?" "Always interesting to see how you implement things." It sounds like casual conversation, but to Penkovsky, this is the signal. I'm the one you're here to meet. They talk about the trade exhibition, about pumps, about Hungary, which is supposedly already buying. Nothing suspicious. And only when the waiter brings the bill does Penkovsky slowly place his hand on the edge of the tablecloth and slide a thin, flat envelope underneath. Wynn casually places the bill on top, folds them together, and slips it into the inner pocket of his briefcase. "Thank you for the company. Likewise, best of luck at the exhibition." No mention of espionage. No "see you again." But both of them know. The contact has been made. It was successful. And now, they're a team. This is how the most dangerous partnership of the Cold War was born. An agreement with no contract. A meeting without an invitation. A mission with no orders. Just a gesture, a glance, an envelope. And trust built on fear, and the belief that neither of them wanted a third world war. Oleg Penkovsky didn't just hand over documents to the West. He delivered the key to understanding the Soviet Union's true military power. A power the West feared, but didn't truly comprehend. He operated with extreme caution. At home, late at night, while his family slept, he would retrieve documents, either smuggled out from work or photographed in his office. At the kitchen table, under a small lamp, he would photograph page after page with a miniature camera. Each photo was a page from the black box of the Soviet military machine. In total, he delivered over 5,000 photographs. Among them, documents of critical importance. First, the technical specifications of Soviet missiles. He described in detail what types of missiles the USSR had, their range, accuracy, warhead weight, and launch times. The West had no clear idea how long it would take the USSR to prepare a missile strike. Thanks to Penkovsky's data, it became clear Soviet missile launches were far from instantaneous. They required complex preparation, and the chances of a surprise nuclear strike were much lower than previously feared. Secondly, Penkovsky delivered maps showing the locations of Soviet nuclear bases. The West knew the missiles existed, but not where they were. Penkovsky provided precise maps, coordinates of bases, garrison sizes, number of operational units. This intelligence became the foundation for satellite flyovers and aerial surveillance. Now, the CIA knew where to look. Third, he revealed the Soviet nuclear command structure in the event of war. He explained how decisions were made in the USSR, who had the authority to launch, and how orders traveled through the system. It showed the process was long, multi-layered, and far less centralized than US analysts had believed. For the first time, the internal logic of Soviet nuclear strategy became clear. But most importantly, Penkovsky dispelled the central myth of the Cold War. The West feared that the USSR had hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and was prepared to strike first. Penkovsky showed documents proving that at that time, the Soviet Union had only a few dozen operational ICBMs, most of them in unstable technical condition. This revelation shifted policy. In the US, leaders began to understand the Soviet Union wasn't the overwhelming threat it appeared to be. And therefore, the US didn't need to make concessions from a position of fear. This truth proved critical during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because of Penkovsky, the Kennedy administration knew Khrushchev was bluffing. His gun wasn't loaded. And that knowledge allowed the US to adopt a hardline stance without triggering total annihilation. Penkovsky operated like a man determined to strip humanity of its most dangerous illusion. His contribution wasn't just espionage, it was a surgical strike against a global lie. October 1962. Cuba, the peak of the Cold War. On satellite images captured by U-2 spy planes, Pentagon analysts noticed strange activity in the Cuban jungle, massive containers, platforms, underground hangars. Within hours, intelligence confirms these are Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, secretly delivered in violation of international agreements. The United States is in shock. These missiles are only 90 miles from Florida. If launched, they could strike Washington in 5 to 7 minutes, with no chance to respond. Emergency meetings begin at the White House. Panic fills the air. The newspapers remain silent, for now. But in the halls of power, there is a terrifying stillness. And that's when a black folder is placed on President John F. Kennedy's desk. Inside is intelligence gathered by the CIA, based on information provided by Penkovsky. The folder is marked Top Secret, Ironbark. This isn't just a report. It's a portrait of the Soviet military from the inside, crafted by Penkovsky over a year, page by page, frame by frame. What did Kennedy find in those documents? First, the truth. The Soviet Union did not possess hundreds of ICBMs, as the US had feared. In reality, they had only a handful, old, inaccurate missiles launched from a single cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, requiring hours of preparation. The missiles shipped to Cuba weren't an act of overwhelming force. They were a desperate attempt to close a strategic gap. Khrushchev couldn't match US missile power from Soviet territory, so he tried to move his arsenal closer. Penkovsky provided diagrams of the Soviet command structure, revealing that missile launches were not instant. Orders had to pass through the General Staff, the Party Committee, and top military commanders. In a crisis, the process could be dangerously slow and uncertain. His materials included GRU reports clearly stating, the USSR did not want a direct confrontation with the United States. Khrushchev was bluffing, but not prepared for real war. It changed everything. Just a day earlier, President Kennedy was torn between launching a full-scale strike and making concessions. Now he had clarity. He understood. The Soviet threat wasn't as strong as it appeared. So, he made a bold, calculated decision. He announced a naval blockade of Cuba, demanded the immediate dismantling of the missile sites, and he didn't back down because he knew Khrushchev had no aces left. And he was right. 13 tense days passed. Then the world exhaled. Soviet ships carrying new missiles to Cuba turned back in the middle of the ocean. Khrushchev publicly agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a US guarantee not to invade Cuba. Not a single warhead was launched. World War III was averted. Now, the most important part? What if Penkovsky hadn't acted? What if there were no 5,000 photographs, no maps, no missile inventories, no analysis of command structures? What if Washington hadn't known what Moscow was actually capable of and what it was merely pretending? The US might have launched a preemptive strike, or, consumed by fear, they might have given up Cuba. In either case, the world could have been reduced to radioactive ash. But they knew, because one man, under the light of a kitchen lamp, night after night, risked everything, so that someone on the other side of the world could make the right decision. Oleg Penkovsky, a man who didn't shed his uniform, didn't flee, didn't break. He simply told the truth, at the exact moment the world needed it most. By mid-1962, something felt off in Soviet intelligence. At first, just minor incidents. Operations faltered on the periphery. Couriers were caught in Turkey. Missions in Iran inexplicably failed. Trusted contacts in France suddenly grew distant. These could still be dismissed as chance, as carelessness, as bourgeois activity. But then things happened that couldn't be explained. In Central Committee offices, Soviet officials read US statements and couldn't believe their eyes. Washington knew too much. As if someone had been sitting next to Soviet generals during their briefings. It became clear there was a mole in Moscow. The KGB launched an internal investigation. At first, it wasn't a manhunt, it was surveillance. Personnel files were rechecked. Travel records were compared. Unusual behavior among staff with access to top-level information was scrutinized. Penkovsky didn't stand out at first. A war veteran, a decorated officer, a diplomat, the perfect cover. But one detail raised suspicion. He had frequent contact with foreigners under the guise of military-industrial cooperation. He had been seen with British representatives. Most critically, he had appeared several times at hotels and cafes where British embassy staff were known to visit. Still not proof, but enough to warrant suspicion. The trap. In September 1962, the KGB carried out a technical operation. They sent Penkovsky a fake telegram, supposedly arranging a new meeting with a British trade partner. He was placed under total surveillance. 3 days, then 10 more. Video monitoring, radio interception, hidden cameras installed in his apartment. And on one of the tapes, the KGB caught him slipping a small cream container into his pocket, a false-bottomed container. Inside it, microfilm. That was the moment he lost the game. The arrest. He was taken at home. Quietly, no drama, no scandal. His wife was confused. His child said nothing. The KGB didn't shout. They simply silently searched the apartment, and they found everything. Microfilm, diagrams, camera equipment, notes, secret messages, all the material he had smuggled from his GRU office over the years. The interrogations began. He was interrogated for days, day and night. No physical torture, but relentless psychological pressure. Penkovsky remained composed. He didn't break immediately. He never gave up another agent. He only admitted what could no longer be denied: his cooperation with the West. To every question, he responded calmly, almost like a lecturer. "Why did you do this?" "Because I wanted to prevent a war." "You're a traitor." "I'm a man tired of lies." Then came the charges, the trial, and the end. In May 1963, Oleg Penkovsky was sentenced to death. His trial was closed to the public. There was barely any mention of him in the Soviet press, only whispers. "There was a general who betrayed us. He's gone now." It remains unclear exactly how he was executed. Some say he was shot. Others believe he met the Kremlin's disappearance method: no grave, no cross, no name. And so ended the life of a man who single-handedly shifted the balance of power between two empires. But his work lived on. The microfilms passed through Greville. Wynne became training manuals for Western intelligence. And Wynne himself? He didn't go unnoticed by the KGB, but that's another chapter. After Penkovsky's arrest, the KGB understood. There were two men in this operation. One was already in their hands. The other still outside the system, but still alive. At that time, Wynne was in Moscow, officially on yet another business trip. He had no idea Penkovsky had been detained, no idea that every eye in the KGB was now watching him. When he returned to his hotel after a business dinner, they were already waiting. The arrest. He was taken in quietly from his hotel room. No drama, no cuffs. They simply told him, "Citizen of Great Britain, you are suspected of engaging in espionage against the Soviet Union. Come with us." In his briefcase, they found diplomatic documents, instructions, contact addresses, and even remnants of microfilm. There was more than enough evidence. Prison. Interrogations. Wynne was thrown into Butyrka prison, one of the harshest in Moscow. His cell was cold, windowless. Days of questioning followed. No physical violence, but complete isolation, mental pressure, and psychological warfare. Wynne, who had no spy training and no military discipline, began to unravel. At first, he stayed silent. Eventually, he began to speak, admitting he had passed materials, but he never truly betrayed Penkovsky. He only confirmed what the KGB already knew. The trial, 1963. Unlike Penkovsky's, Wynne's trial was partially public. The Soviets used it for propaganda. Look at this agent of British imperialism invading our peaceful society. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of being sent to a labor camp. But he never made it to the camp. A few months later, under pressure from the British government, prisoner exchange negotiations began. The USSR wanted back Soviet agents captured in the West. In return, they agreed to release Wynne. In 1964, Greville Wynne was exchanged for Conan Molody, alias Gordon Lonsdale, a Soviet spy caught in London. The swap took place on a bridge in Berlin, just like in the movies. Life after. Wynne returned home, but he was never the same man again. After prison, interrogation, and a shattered psyche, he spent years recovering. He suffered from depression and alcoholism. His wife left him. The press called him the British James Bond, but Wynne hated the comparison. He wrote a memoir, The Man from Moscow, where he told part of his story, though much was left between the lines. Wynne died in 1990, quietly, with little mention in the newspapers. But in the archives of British intelligence and the CIA, there's still a note attached to his file. Civilian courier, essential link, mission completed. He was never given a medal, never turned into a hero, but it was he, the faceless man, who kept the channel alive. Because of him, Penkovsky was able to deliver the truth that changed the world. Oleg Penkovsky and GRU weren't soldiers, but they helped prevent a war that could have ended the world. One revealed the truth, the other carried it. Together, they became the key to peace at the edge of nuclear disaster.